Emil Boyesen feels the resistance before he sees anything. May 6, 1950, Bjældskovdal Bog, 12 kilometers west of Silkeborg, Denmark. The peat spade stops mid-cut, not a root, not a stone, something that gives but does not break. His brother Viggo kneels in the black earth. They have been cutting peat since morning, stacking the bricks to dry for winter fuel. Every farmer in Jutland does this. The peat is 8 feet deep here, older than any church in Denmark. Viggo reaches into the cut. He pulls back immediately. A face is looking up at him from the ground. The skin is dark leather, perfectly formed. The eyes are closed. The expression is peaceful, almost sleepy. There is stubble on the chin. The lips are pressed together as if the man is concentrating on something. Viggo sees the rope. It is still knotted, still pulled tight against the skin of the neck. Braided leather, the type you would use to tether livestock. The knot sits just below the left ear. The rope has not rotted, neither has the skin, neither has the man. By evening the police have arrived. By the following morning, Professor P.V. Glob from Aarhus University is standing in the bog with a measuring tape and a camera. He has studied bog bodies before. He knows what the Boyesen brothers have found. Not a recent murder, not a medieval burial. Something older, something that should not exist in this condition. The man in the peat has been dead for more than 2,000 years. His fingerprints are intact. His internal organs are complete. The last meal is still in his stomach. He was placed in the bog during the Roman Empire, when Denmark was a forest and a mystery to the civilized world. And he is still here, leather-skinned and rope-necked, waiting for someone to ask why. You are watching the Ember Hour. We examine the past through the evidence that refuses to disappear. The cases where the physical record survives but the explanation does not. This is one of those cases. Bogs are not swamps. A swamp has moving water. A bog has standing water, acidic and oxygen poor, accumulating layers of dead sphagnum moss that do not decompose. Peat forms in these conditions over thousands of years. In northern Europe, peat bogs cover portions of Denmark, the Netherlands, northern Germany, Ireland, and Britain. The chemistry of a bog prevents decay. The sphagnum moss releases tannic and humic acids. The water becomes acidic with a pH between 3 and 4. Bacteria that decompose organic matter cannot survive. Oxygen is absent below the surface. Anything submerged in a peat bog enters a state of suspension. The man the Boyesen brothers found would be named Tolland Man, after the nearby village of Tolland. He was not the first bog body discovered in Denmark. He was not even the first that year, but he was the most complete, the most intact, the most human. Bog bodies have been surfacing in northern Europe since at least the 1600s. Most were reburied, assumed to be recent drownings or forgotten Christian burials. Some were dismissed as supernatural. In 1835, a body found in a German bog was given a Christian funeral. In 1871, laborers in the Netherlands discovered a woman so well preserved they reported her to the police as a murder victim. Carbon dating would later show she died in the 1st century AD. By the time Tolland Man emerged in 1950, archaeologists understood what they were looking at. P.V. Glob had been studying Iron Age Denmark for 2 decades. He knew the bogs were not graveyards. The Iron Age people of Northern Europe buried their dead in earthen mounds or cremated them. Bodies in bogs were something else. Glob supervised the removal of Toland Man over 3 days. The body was lifted in a single block of peat and transported to the National Museum in Copenhagen. The conservation process began immediately. Peat-preserved bodies deteriorate rapidly once exposed to air. The skin dries and cracks. The features collapse. Toland Man's face stopped researchers in silence. The skin was wrinkled and dark, tanned by the tannic acid in the peat. But the features were complete, eyelids closed, lips pressed together in a neutral expression. The stubble on his chin was trimmed short, maybe 3 days of growth. Wrinkles at the corners of the eyes suggested he was between 30 and 40 years old when he died. The rope was still knotted tight, braided leather, smooth and even, the work of someone who knew cordage. The knot was positioned under the left ear, the method used for judicial hanging in later European history. But Toland Man was not hanged in the traditional sense. His neck was not broken. The vertebrae were intact. He had been strangled. Slowly, the rope tightened until the blood stopped reaching his brain. He wore a cap made of sheepskin, stitched with leather cord. The cap was simple, functional, the type worn by laborers. He wore no other clothing. His body showed no signs of disease, no malnutrition, no injuries except the rope. Before he died, Toland Man was healthy. The stomach contents were intact. Researchers removed the material and analyzed it under magnification. Toland Man's last meal was a porridge made from barley, linseed, knotweed, and bristlegrass. No meat, no fat. The seeds indicated the meal was consumed in late winter or early spring. Between 12 and 24 hours before he died, Toland Man ate porridge. Radiocarbon dating placed his death between 405 and 380 BC, the early Iron Age in Denmark. The Roman Republic had not yet become an empire. Scandinavia was unmapped by Mediterranean scholars. The people living in Jutland left no written language, no cities, no monuments. What we know of them comes from objects buried in bogs and graves. Toland Man is one of those objects. The preservation is not complete. Peat destroys bone. The calcium in bone dissolves in acidic water. Toland Man's skeleton was barely present. His skull was soft, collapsing under gentle pressure. The long bones of the legs and arms had the consistency of wet cardboard. What the peat preserved was skin, hair, nails, internal organs, and soft tissue. The parts of the body that normally disappear first. The skin undergoes a transformation called tanning. The tannic acid in the bog water binds to the collagen in the skin, turning it into leather. The process is identical to traditional leather tanning, except it happens slowly over centuries without human intervention. The result is skin that looks ancient and fresh at the same time, wrinkled, dark, but unmistakably human. Fingerprints remain visible. The ridges and whorls are clear enough to be recorded. In several bog bodies, forensic teams have successfully lifted prints using modern techniques. The hands of Toland Man were well preserved, the skin tough but flexible. His fingers were slightly curled, as if he had been holding something before he died. Internal organs survive in varying condition. The heart, liver, lungs, and intestines remain identifiable. The brain sometimes survives, shrunken but structurally intact. In some bog bodies, researchers have found brain matter preserved well enough to identify individual cells under a microscope. The chemistry that destroys bone protects the parts of us that are supposed to vanish. More than 2,000 bog bodies have been discovered across northern Europe. Most are fragments, a foot, a hand, a section of torso. About 300 are substantial enough to study. Of those, perhaps 100 retain enough detail to be called individuals, people with faces, people you could recognize if you passed them on a street. YDE girl was found in the Netherlands in 1897. She was approximately 16 years old. Her hair was intact, long and reddish, the color altered by the peat. A woolen band was wrapped around her neck, tightened until it cut into the skin. Her skull showed evidence of blunt force trauma. Someone struck her on the side of the head, then strangled her, then placed her face down in the bog. Old Krogan man was found in Ireland in 2003. Only his arms and torso survived. His hands were remarkably preserved. The fingernails were trimmed and clean. Analysis of the nitrogen isotopes in his nails indicated he ate a diet high in meat, consistent with high social status. His arms showed no signs of manual labor. Whoever he was, old Krogan man did not work with his hands, but he died violently. His nipples had been cut off, and he had been stabbed in the chest before being placed in the bog. Lindo man was discovered in England in 1984. He was in his mid-20s, well-groomed with trimmed hair and beard. His stomach contained traces of mistletoe pollen. He had been struck twice on the head with a blunt object, strangled with a cord, and his throat had been cut. 3 different methods of killing applied to one person before he was placed in the bog. The pattern repeats. Healthy individuals, no signs of disease or chronic malnutrition, evidence of grooming, then violence, strangulation, blunt force trauma, stabbing, throat cutting, often multiple methods applied to the same person, and always the bog, always the placement in water that would prevent decay. The bodies date from the late Bronze Age through the early medieval period, roughly 1000 BC to 800 AD, but the majority cluster in the Iron Age between 400 BC and 400 AD, the same period when the Roman Empire expanded across Europe, the same period when written accounts from Roman scholars described the customs of the northern tribes. Customs that included ritual sacrifice. 2 years after Tolland man, another discovery. April 26, 1952, Groball Bog, 10 kilometers from where Tolland man had been found. Peat cutters working for the Groball brickworks exposed a body lying face down in the peat. The workers assumed it was a recent burial, possibly a missing person from the area. They contacted the police. Groball man was more complete than Tolland man. The entire body was intact, lying in a natural position, right arm bent beneath the torso, left arm extended. The peat had compressed the body, flattening it slightly, but every part remained. He was naked. The skin was dark red-brown, the color of old leather. His face was turned to the side. The mouth was open, frozen in an expression that looked like pain or shock. The teeth were visible, well preserved, showing wear patterns consistent with a diet of coarse grain. The hair was intact, reddish-brown, cut short above the ears. He had been between 30 and 40 years old when he died. The throat was cut, ear to ear. The wound was deep, severing the esophagus and major blood vessels. The cut was made with a sharp blade, possibly iron, drawn across the throat in a single motion from left to right. The angle and depth suggested someone standing behind him, pulling his head back, then cutting. His hands showed no defensive wounds. He had not fought. Either he was restrained or he did not resist. The right hand was bent beneath the torso in a way that suggested it had been placed there deliberately, not fallen naturally. The fingernails were intact. Like old Krogan man, they were clean and trimmed. Not the hands of someone who worked the fields. The skull showed evidence of blunt force trauma, a fracture on the right side, above the temple. The blow had been significant enough to crack the bone. It would have caused concussion, possibly unconsciousness. The blow came before the throat was cut. Someone struck Growball Man on the head, likely knocking him to the ground or rendering him dazed, then cut his throat. The stomach contents were analyzed at the University of Aarhus. Growball Man's last meal was similar to Tollen Man's. Porridge made from barley, oats, and seeds of knotweed and bristlegrass. More than 60 different plant species were identified in the mixture. Some were deliberate, cultivated grains, others were weeds, possibly included by accident or because the harvest had been poor. Among the plant material, researchers found traces of ergot fungus. Ergot grows on rye and other grains, producing alkaloid compounds that affect the nervous system. In large doses, ergot causes convulsions, hallucinations, and death. In controlled amounts, it can induce altered states of consciousness. The ergot in Growball Man's stomach was present in trace amounts, not enough to poison, possibly enough to alter perception. Radiocarbon dating placed his death around 290 BC, give or take 50 years. The Late Iron Age, the same general period as Toland Man. Both men died within a century of each other, in bogs less than 10 kilometers apart. Both were healthy, both were well-groomed, both ate grain-based final meals, both died violently. Growball Man now rests in the Mosgard Museum near Aarhus. The body was treated with preservatives in the 1950s, a process that stabilized the tissue but darkened the skin further. You can stand 3 feet from him and see the expression on his face. The mouth still open, the teeth still visible, the cut on his throat still clear. He has been dead for 23 centuries. He does not look peaceful. The violence is not random. The bog bodies were not murdered in fits of rage or desperation. The injuries are methodical. Multiple methods of killing applied to single individuals. Overkill in forensic terms. More violence than necessary to end a life. Toland Man was strangled with a rope. Growball Man was struck on the head and his throat was cut. Lindo Man was struck twice, strangled, and had his throat cut. Yidi Girl was struck on the head and strangled. The methods vary, but the principle does not. These people were killed with intention and ceremony. The placement is deliberate. Bog bodies are not found in the deep center of bogs. They are found at the edges in shallow water within sight of dry land. Many are discovered near ancient wooden trackways, paths built across bogs to allow foot traffic. The bodies were placed where they could be seen from the paths, at least initially, before the peat covered them. Some bodies were pinned down. Wooden stakes or forked branches were placed over them, holding them beneath the water. Toland Man was not pinned. He was placed carefully, lying on his side in a sleeping position. Growball Man was face down, as if he had been thrown or laid hastily. The difference in treatment suggests different circumstances or different meanings. The timing is consistent. Stomach contents from multiple bog bodies indicate they ate final meals in late winter or early spring. Grains that would have been stored from the previous harvest. seeds from early growing weeds. No summer fruits, no autumn nuts. The deaths happened during the hungry months, the time before the fields turned green again. Iron Age Denmark was not literate, but it was not primitive. These people worked iron, wove textiles, built ships, and traded with distant cultures. They left behind finely crafted jewelry, weapons with intricate designs, and evidence of organized settlements. They had social structure. They had laws, recorded orally and enforced by community consensus. They had religious practices. Bogs were sacred. Across northern Europe, Iron Age people deposited valuable objects into bogs: swords, shields, jewelry, coins, wagons. The objects were often damaged before being deposited, bent or broken, rendered useless. This was not storage. This was offering. The bogs were liminal spaces, thresholds between the world of the living and something else. The only written accounts come from outsiders. Roman historians observed the tribes of northern Europe from a distance, recording customs that seemed strange or barbaric. Tacitus, writing around 98 AD, described the Germanic tribes in his work Germania. He mentioned ritual executions. Criminals and cowards were pressed down into bogs under weighted hurdles. The community would not touch them. The bog consumed them. Tacitus distinguished between public executions and private killings. Public executions were reserved for traitors and deserters, hung from trees as warnings. Bog burials were for the shameful. Those guilty of cowardice or moral crimes, pressed into the mud and covered so they would disappear. But Tacitus was describing tribes 200 kilometers south of Denmark, and his account was written 3 centuries after Tollendman died. It is evidence, but not proof. The bodies do not match Tacitus's description entirely. Many show signs of high status, clean nails, no evidence of manual labor, well fed. These were not cowards or criminals, at least not by the definition we would recognize. And the violence is too elaborate. You do not strike someone on the head, strangle them, cut their throat, and then carefully place them in a bog if you are simply disposing of a criminal. That is ceremony. I find the execution theory unconvincing. The pattern does not fit punishment. It fits sacrifice, the overkill, the placement in sacred spaces, the timing during late winter, the final meals of grain porridge. These details suggest ritual, not justice. Someone, or several someones, was being given to the bog. If the bog bodies are sacrifices, the question becomes why? Not the motive, which is unknowable, but the function. What role did human sacrifice serve in Iron Age Northern Europe? What problem did it solve? The agricultural theory is the most common. Northern Europe in the Iron Age was cold and marginal for farming. Summers were short. Winters were brutal. Crop failures meant famine. A community of 200 people living in wooden houses dependent on grain stores that might not last until spring would have been desperate to ensure the next harvest. Sacrifice could have been an appeal for fertility, a blood offering to whatever force controlled the growing season. The Norse goddess Nerthus is mentioned by Tacitus. She was a fertility deity, worshipped by tribes in Denmark. Her sacred wagon was kept on an island and brought out during festivals. After the ceremony, the wagon and the slaves who attended it were drowned in a sacred lake. The slaves who touched the goddess did not return. Tacitus describes this as an honor. The bog bodies could be offerings to Nerthus or a similar deity given during the lean months to ensure spring would come. The substitute king theory is more specific. In some cultures, the king or chief was held responsible for the prosperity of the land. If the crops failed, the king had failed. The solution was to replace the king. But killing the actual king destabilized the community. The alternative was to select a substitute, someone who would serve as king for a brief period, then be sacrificed in place of the real king. The substitute received honors, fine treatment, possibly even a final meal of special significance, then died so the real king could continue. The condition of some bog bodies supports this. Clean hands, no signs of labor, well fed. These individuals were treated differently before they died. Old Krogan man in Ireland had his nipples cut off, a symbolic emasculation possibly linked to disqualifying him as a ruler. If he was a substitute king or a failed king, the mutilation would mark his loss of status before his death. The community selection theory suggests the sacrifices were volunteers or chosen individuals, selected by the community to serve as intermediaries. They would carry the prayers or needs of the people into the next world, or into the bog, which might have been seen as a gateway. The final meal could have been a communion, a shared substance that bound the sacrifice to the community before the separation. The presence of ergot in Grauball man's stomach is difficult to dismiss. Ergot alkaloids cause altered states, visions, dissociation. If ergot was given intentionally, the sacrifice might have been drugged before death, either to calm them or to induce a religious experience. Shamanic practices in other cultures use psychoactive substances to facilitate communication with the divine. Grauball man might have been walking between worlds when his throat was cut. The prisoner theory is less satisfying but still possible. Some bog bodies could be war captives, executed after raids or battles. The timing would explain the late winter deaths when stored food was low and additional mouths could not be fed. Captives might be killed as offerings to gods of war, or simply disposed of in sacred spaces to prevent their spirits from returning. But this does not explain the careful placement, the final meals, the lack of defensive wounds. I return to Toland man's face. The expression is not terror, it is not rage, it is calm, almost meditative. His eyes are closed, his lips are pressed together gently. If you did not see the rope, you would think he was sleeping. That suggests he accepted what was happening, or was unconscious, or was in an altered state that removed fear. People who fight strangulation do not look peaceful. Toland man looks like someone who let go. I find the volunteer theory most convincing. Not volunteers in the modern sense, not people who chose freely from a position of power, but individuals selected by circumstance, duty, or belief, who accepted their role because the alternative was worse. If your community believed the harvest depended on the sacrifice and you were chosen, refusal would mean condemning everyone you knew to starvation. The violence would be part of the ritual, necessary to complete the offering. You would eat the final meal. You would walk to the bog. You would kneel. And the people you loved would do what had to be done. We do not know their names. We call them Toland man, Grauball man, Lindo man, after the places they were found. We do not know if they had families. We do not know if they were mourned. We do not know what they believed. The religion that placed them in the bogs left no texts, no temples, no scriptures. What we call sacrifice might have been something else entirely, a practice we have no word for because it no longer exists. We do not know how many bodies remain undiscovered. Peat bogs are vast, thousands of acres across northern Europe, many never excavated. The bodies we have found might be a fraction of the total, or they might be all that were ever placed there. Rare events in communities where human life was valued too much to waste. We do not know if the practice ended gradually or suddenly. The bog body chronology thins out around 400 AD. Christianity was spreading north. Roman influence was collapsing. The climate was shifting. Whether the sacrifices stopped because of new beliefs, new prosperity, or new disasters is speculation. We do not know what the people who placed them there expected to happen. Did they believe the bodies would be found? Did they believe the bog would preserve them, or consume them, or transform them into something else? The preservation might be an accident of chemistry, or it might be the entire point. What we know is this: Toland man died approximately 2,400 years ago. He was strangled with a leather rope. He was placed in a bog 8 feet deep. The peat turned his skin to leather. It dissolved his bones. It preserved his face. In 1950, 2 brothers cutting fuel for winter pulled him into daylight, and his expression had not changed. Whatever happened to him in that bog, whatever ritual or execution or offering concluded with the rope around his neck, he accepted it with closed eyes and a peaceful face. More than 2,000 bodies have been found in the bogs of northern Europe. More are discovered every decade. Each one is a person. Each one was killed deliberately. Each one was placed in water that would not let them rot. The pattern is undeniable. The meaning is not. Gruballman's mouth is still open. His throat is still cut. The wound has not healed and never will. He lies in a museum in Denmark, behind glass, under lights that do not flicker. Visitors walk past in silence. Some take photographs. Most just stare. What do you say to a man who has been dead since the Iron Age, but whose face you can still read? The bodies are evidence. Evidence of belief systems we no longer understand. Evidence of desperation or devotion or something between the two. Evidence that people in the past were willing to do things we find incomprehensible, and they did those things with enough consistency that we call it culture. The bogs are still there. The chemistry has not changed. If you were placed in a peat bog today, in water acidic enough and cold enough and oxygen poor enough, your body would begin the same transformation. Your bones would dissolve, your skin would tan, your face would darken but remain. 2,000 years from now, someone might find you, and they would not know your name or why you were there, or what you believed when you closed your eyes for the last time. Toland man is still in Denmark. His body was freeze-dried after discovery, a process that preserved the head but caused the torso to deteriorate. Only the head remains on display. The face you can visit in the Silkeborg Museum is the original. The leather skin, the closed eyes, the expression of someone who knew what was coming and did not fight. This case remains open.